And welcome to the Granite State Room here at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, and the second in our series of joint appearances by candidates for their party's presidential nomination. Last week we had the Republicans, this week the Democrats. And gentlemen, I must say, what a relief it is for me to be here with Democrats who never fight among themselves after those quarrelsome Republicans. Let's go on and meet the candidates now, and we'll begin with Paul Simon. Paul Simon, Illinois Legislature, 1955 to 1969. Lieutenant Governor, 1969 to 1973. U.S. House of Representatives, 10 years. U.S. Senator since 1985. Albert Gore, Jr., Tennessee. U.S. House of Representatives, 1977 to 1985. U.S. Senator since 1985. Bruce Babbitt, Arizona, U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity, 1965 to 1967 in the Johnson administration. Arizona Attorney General, 3 years. Governor, 1978 to 1987. Jesse Jackson, Chicago, Director, Operation Breadbasket, 1966 to 1971. President, Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity, 1971 to 1983. Candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, 1984 and 88. Richard Gephardt, Missouri, St. Louis Board of Aldermen, 5 years. U.S. House of Representatives, 10 years, and still there. Chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. Michael Dukakis, Massachusetts Legislature, 1963 to 1970. Elected governor, 1974, defeated after one term. Elected again in 1982 and in 1986, still governor. Gary Hart, Colorado, elected to the U.S. Senate 1974 and 1980. Resigned after 2 terms. Candidate for the presidential nomination 1984 and 1988. Abandoned his campaign in May of last year following stories about his involvement with a Miami model. Returned to the race in December, thereby answering the question posed in the song, "Will You Love Me in December as You Do in May?" Now, our 4-act drama. I will put questions to each of you. After that, we'll open it up for a brief general discussion before we go on to the next question. Then we'll have questions for each candidate from students here at the University of New Hampshire, and I think those questions will stimulate some discussion. Once we've finished with the students' questions, we hope to have time to talk about the Democratic Party and the state of the country today. And finally, from each of you, closing statements. I have here a little bell, and I'll hope to use that if anybody runs over. And I'd like to begin the questioning with Mr. Simon. In one of the, I think it's 11 books that you wrote, you talked about giving free telephones to people who were poor, putting the telephones in their homes. And you wrote, "We could reduce crime, provide safety for a health or fire emergency, enrich people's lives, and provide jobs for tens of thousands of people." My question, Mr. Simon, is who pays for that? Where's the money coming from if you were, and I'm not saying you're proposing it in your campaign, to put telephones in the homes of all the poor people in this country?
First, thanks for the plug for my books, John. I appreciate that. Second, I think we have to recognize that there are people who really are doing without in our society. And one of the things that we ought to be as a party is a party who cares for working men and women and for the less fortunate. When I was a boy, most of my relatives on farms didn't have electricity. Now every home in this nation has electricity. We now have 7 million American homes that don't have a telephone. Poor people. They can't call a fire department. They can't call a police department. They can't call a doctor. If we had phones that were set up in such a way that you couldn't call long distance, and you said you fall below a certain income level, you could get them, and you could call then in that kind of a case, and you would pay for it. And this is not part of my campaign platform, but I favor it. Say a 2% tax on long distance calls. We'd be a richer, better nation if we did it. But the fundamental thing is, I want a party and a government that cares about the less fortunate.
And you'd pay for it through a tax on long-distance phone calls?
Long-distance calls. Each of us, because those of us who make long-distance calls, by and large, can afford it. We could have a tax of 2%, and I think we'd be a better nation.
Mr. Babbitt?
Paul, I think there's a broader question of who pays for it, because, you see, this campaign hasn't had much truth-telling in it. What's the liberal agenda going to amount to? How are we going to provide those programs unless we're honest about that deficit? How it is we reduce expenditures, the need to raise taxes, the need to be honest about America's future. Now, the answer I'd like to hear from you is telephones apart. What about the other $200 billion in this budget? And when are we all going to sort of step up to the real character issue in this campaign, talk about how we close that deficit and make this future come true?
May I respond, John? First, I have outlined in a 14-page white paper in detail how we move on a deficit, and then I restructure the priorities. I don't take the Reagan administration priorities. I've said we're going to invest in education, in jobs, long-term care. But I also want to do some other things that frankly do help the less fortunate. And I didn't hear you respond to John's question, Bruce. What about telephones for those poor people?
What kind of cuts are you going to make specifically? Are you willing to raise taxes?
I have said I'll raise taxes as a last resort, not the first resort.
That's code language.
But you're still, you're asking another question instead of answering John's question, Bruce.
Can we move on? Everybody's hand is up on this one.
Okay.
Mr. Jackson.
It seems to me that what is fundamental about what Paul Simon is proposing is not just the language, but the message. The message is that the language of our budget ought to reflect a level of care for the dispossessed, the homeless, the poor, the disenfranchised that does not exist. We can't keep on using some numerical rationalizations to keeping the abandoned. That's the message. On the question of where the taxes should come from, I've argued several times, those who had the Reagan party, the $600 billion tax break, they should now pay for the party. Those who were not invited shouldn't pay for it. So the 400,000 highest earned income Americans who make 192,000 above, if the tax bracket for them is 38% as opposed to 28%, that's $20 billion. If for corporations it's the 1980 level of taxation, that's another $20 billion. And if the incentive is to reinvest in America and retrain our workers and reindustrialize our nation as opposed to merging corporations and purging workers, that's another source. If Europe will better share the burden of its own defense 45 years later, those are major areas where the money went in 1980, and that's where the money must come from in 1988 and 89.
Briefly, Senator Hart.
American people know that the Democratic Party is a party of compassion. They've seen our shopping list of all the things we're for. We've also lost 4 out of 5 last national elections, and the issue is because they don't think we can govern this country, that we're not for a strong defense, and we don't know how to pay the bills. That's why I put out a budget that does, in fact, respond to the questions raised by Governor Babbitt, and does, in fact, respond to the American people who want to know how's the Democratic Party going to pay for all these things we're for. I think everybody here ought to put out a budget, not just tell people what they're for, but how they're going to pay for it, how to get the Reagan deficits down, and how to finance the human resource needs of this nation. I must also say, Mr. Chancellor, I think that's a lot more important in people's minds than the questionable taste of your introduction.
Well, I meant that Well, let me explain that. I mean, all I meant was it's interesting that you'd bring it up, is that you loved this party in May and you came back and loved it again in December. I don't know why you would add anything to that. But apparently people have. I certainly didn't mean to be offensive. I thought it was a kind of nice old joke. Senate, Mr. Gore.
Yeah,
listen, we've run out of time.
Well, can I address it briefly?
Sure.
Okay. Obviously, it's unrealistic in this day and time with the constraints we have to propose giving free telephones to everybody who needs a telephone. However, the question of telephone service for low-income people, quite apart from the larger context of the question, is important in and of itself. The Reagan administration, Federal Communications Commission, and Justice Department has instituted a new program of, in effect, taxing local users, including low-income users of telephone service, in order to subsidize competition for long-distance service, which is dominated by large commercial users. They call it access charges. I'm the principal sponsor of legislation in the Congress to reverse the current approach of the Reagan administration. It is not fair to tax low-income telephone users to subsidize long-distance service if they don't even use long-distance service. We ought to get back to the principle of universal service, not by providing free telephones, but by trying to keep the rates for basic lifeline-style service low enough so that the maximum number of people can afford it.
All right. The next question goes to you, Mr. Gore. We've all seen on television these really riveting pictures from the West Bank and Gaza and from Israel itself, demonstrations, beatings, and all of that. On Friday, the Secretary General of the United Nations says that there must be a political settlement that was fair to the Palestinians and fair to Israel. Also on Friday, we were told by the White House that the administration plans no new initiative in the Middle East, no special envoy. Now, as you know, the United States, Britain, the Israeli Labor Party, King Hussein, everybody wants an international conference on this. If you were president, what would you do about these problems? How would you try to solve this 20-year-old problem?
Well, first of all, I would be personally and intimately involved with the peace process. We saw a tremendous success during the Camp David process, resulting in a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, and the formula was territory for peace. That agreement anticipated further progress with regard to the status of the West Bank and Gaza. The next logical step in the process has to do with negotiations between Israel and Jordan to deal with the status of the West Bank and Gaza in a formula that does not threaten Israel's security at all, but that does give some measure of autonomy, at least in local affairs, and an expression of international identity in confederation with Jordan. But the United States cannot specify the details of such a treaty in advance. That must come from the parties themselves, and the United States must use our good offices in advancing the peace process. That will require presidential leadership from a president who understands what's involved, who understands what the stakes are, what our interests are in the region, and how to go about advancing the peace process. This administration has failed to do that for the last 7 years. They recently said, well, we're beginning to talk about the possibility of a new initiative. That should have taken place back in 1981. That is, the failure of this administration to do it is one of the reasons why the situation has gotten to this stage.
Mr. Gephardt.
Let's go back to where we were in 1980. We'd gone through about 10 years of 2 administrations working very hard to bring the parties in the region together so that there could be a movement toward peace. Henry Kissinger and the Nixon administration spent a lot of time in the region. Then Jimmy Carter, Cyrus Vance, and others spent a lot of time working on this problem. And finally, Anwar Sadat made a leap of courage, got on an airplane, went to Tel Aviv, went to the Knesset, recognized Israel, and the negotiation began. But even then, it wasn't done. America had to still lead and be involved. We had the Camp David process, and at the end of it, there was a way for that process to go on so that we could get to a settlement of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That process stopped cold the day Ronald Reagan came to office, and it hasn't moved one step.
Would anybody say that it stopped cold, as many critics say, when Menachem Begin began to slow down the implementation of the Camp David Accords? Would any candidate here say that?
That was a major factor. The expansion to the West Bank was a mistake. It was a great impediment to the process. Sadat didn't just leap on that plane. American emissaries took to Sadat offers of security, the exchange of territory, and took to Mr. Begin securities. What the American president did was to get both of them to move from mutual annihilation to mutual recognition by offering them the security neither could offer the other. You had to bring in Egypt and Israel, not third parties. In this instance, you simply must have a president willing to convene Israeli and Palestinian leadership, free them of the death grip that they're now embracing each other with, in exchange for mutual security, for mutual recognition. We cannot keep avoiding the fundamental issue. We have at least 4 steps in our foreign policy doctrine: international law, self-determination, human rights, and economic development. All 4 principles are presently being violated. And there will be no security for Israel until there is justice for Palestinians. And if that happens, there will be peace for both. I am convinced that we must assume another quality level of leadership to reach out and offer Israel the security that it needs, the Palestinians the justice that they deserve, and you'll have peace for both.
Senator Simon, briefly, because we have to move on to other
Yes.
subjects.
I think 3 of us have been to the Gaza Strip. One of the problems of the Gaza Strip, much more severe than the West Bank, is there is hopelessness. They belong to no country, they see no future, and the United States has to be that force that brings Israel, Jordan, and Palestinian leaders together that, frankly, both Israel and Jordan could agree upon. I think it can happen. There's been no action for 7 years. That's the real problem.
John, can I get a word in edgewise here?
Sure, yes.
Begin is yesterday. We're talking about the future, and there's a new factor here which I think ought to be seriously considered, particularly after the completion of the Soviet-U.S. summit. Mr. Gorbachev says he wants to work with us to stop or reduce regional conflict. For the first time, the Soviet Union seems to be reaching out to Israel. I challenge Gorbachev. Why doesn't the Soviet Union recognize Israel? Why don't they go to work with their client state Syria to bring them into the peace process? I think that's something where we ought to challenge Gorbachev, see whether he's serious. It might conceivably add something to the bringing of peace to the Middle East.
But Mr. Chancellor, I must say, we're missing something very valid here. In the name of love and security, we are putting upon Israel an unbearable burden, the burden of occupation. It's too great a burden to bear emotionally, it's draining. Politically, it's divisive. Economically, it's too costly. Militarily, it's too bloody. The most direct point is we must assume the initiative to relieve Israel of the burden of occupation by offering Israel the security that only we can offer Israel, and by offering to the Palestinians the justice that they deserve. We cannot rail about international law being violated in Central America and being violated in South Africa. When it comes to the Middle East, try to impose a wholly different set of impractical, non-working doctrines.
Jesse, the record is not complete, however, without saying that the administration had the opportunity in 1986. I came back after meeting with all 3 heads of state in the region to do exactly what Paul Simon said and Jesse has said, that is to offer economic hope for the Palestinians in the camps. A specific bill to have an international economic development cooperative effort in that region to give those youth some jobs and some opportunity. The administration would not support it.
And some empowerment.
Could I make one other point here briefly on this?
Can we say that this is the last point?
Yes,
on
please.
this?
That's fine with me, yes. The central fact remains that no Arab leader has been willing to come forward and demonstrate the courage and vision of Anwar Sadat. And the cup is now passed to King Hussein. He is in the key position. We have failed to push the process forward. And one other point briefly, the Iran-Iraq war relates to the opportunity which may now be present. Iraq and Syria have been the 2 most implacable foes of the peace process. Iraq and Syria are both diverted by the Iran-Iraq. Iraq as a combatant, Syria because it is enmeshed in the politics of the Arab League and was supporting Iran against a fellow Arab nation. We should understand that this is a perishable opportunity, a window of opportunity that is closing. It's imperative to start shuttle diplomacy and personal involvement by the President of the United States.
John, I will not hide behind Hussein. I will convene the right forces to bring about peace.
We've got to move on, gentlemen, if we're going to ask a question to each one of you. I'm sorry. Mr. Babbitt, you've been praised for your proposals, some of them very specific on domestic issues, but your foreign experience is limited. A few summers working in Latin America doing social work. I want to ask you about...
What's so bad about that?
Not a thing. Let's move on, though, to nuclear policy. And your statement that the United States will never be the first to use nuclear weapons in any conflict.
But I didn't say that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you did.
Absolutely not. What I said was that I believe we should structure the defense of Europe so that we're not in a position of the early first use of nuclear weapons. You see, we're defending Europe based on the earliest use of nuclear weapons. General Galvin, for example, says if something happens within the first week of the war, I will have to escalate and go nuclear. Now, do you think that's a reasonable deterrent position? Well, I don't.
No, I'm not. I don't want to argue with you.
Oh, come on, please do.
I think you're arguing with the Wall Street Journal, which reported that you not only said that you didn't want first use of nuclear weapons, but in the next paragraph, the Journal quoted General Brent Scowcroft as saying this is sending the Europeans up
here's
the wall.
Precisely what I said in speech at Tufts University. I said, if you elect me president, I will ask the NATO commanders to begin planning the defense of Europe on the assumption that we would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. Now, you see what that says to the generals is, you can't keep relying on early first use. I want to see a real conventional defense. Now, what does that add up to in terms of policy? It says that we should pull back from the early threatened first use of nuclear weapons. We can't abandon our nuclear deterrent for obvious reasons, but I don't think it's reasonable to say that in the event of the first hostilities, we have no choice except to escalate and then start a nuclear war.
Well, your position is not, and if I'm going to get somebody else in this, but General Rogers and General Galvin after him kept asking for more conventional arms so they wouldn't have to use nuclear arms.
If I'm president, they're going to get them.
All right, I think
But that's not the issue. See, that's the old defense thinking, which says spend more money, buy more weapons. If you're buying the wrong kinds of weapons, you're not going to be stronger, either in terms of the United States military or our NATO allies. We have to reform our military institutions and the way they think and implement those reforms in our military alliances, particularly in NATO. For example, how many people here know that we have only 2 reserve divisions prepared to go if we have conflict in Europe? Only 2. Now, our allies can begin to prepare in very specific ways to have those reserve divisions. And this administration and our party, the Democratic Party, is not talking about how to restructure our own conventional forces in a way that does make us stronger without spending more money.
Well, we'll have to spend a little more money in a few select places. Don't you agree with that?
Well, sure, but that's not the solution.
It's not the complete solution.
3 real quick points. First, Gary's right, and the work he's done on military modernization is good. If some of these ideas, more of these ideas were put in place, we'd be in a better position in terms of our conventional defense. Second, the other thing we have to do that I think all of us believe is rather than rearming Europe, we've got to fight for arms control. And arms control means conventional arms control as well. The third point is this. If we're going to really get active and serious about better conventional defense in Europe, the great burden of it has to fall on Europe. This is not 1947 anymore. We can't support $2.5 billion worth of troops in Japan, a huge number of troops in Europe, and then look to spending even more money in the future for the defense of these areas. The world has changed, we've changed, we've got to ask them to do more if that is what we're going to do.
Next question to Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson, some say that the country's not ready to elect a black president. I don't really know how many people believe that, since you seem to be doing pretty well in the polls. But let's set race aside and examine your politics. You are the most liberal member of this group. You last year sent a letter of praise to Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, praising him for the Sandinista efforts for peace. You're for cutting defense, for a national health service, for ending all nuclear power. You have been seen in embracing Fidel Castro and Yasser Arafat. So here's my question. Let's forget race. Is the country ready to elect someone as far left as you are?
Well, first of all, you cannot forget race. It is a factor, and it is a self-evident factor, and it is a test America must pass, as it has had tests relative to the women and other groups who have been excluded historically. Well, let's look at Central America. My proposal that we support the Arias Plan is right down the center of American policy. The Reagan policy is far to the right. My policy is a sound one. But my quest for the negotiation in the Middle East and to end that conflict by offering security for Israel and justice for Palestinians and sharing territory and power is a very central position in the world community. My position that we should, in our complicity with South Africa and have a new approach to that region, is a very solid position. I support the position of the IMF treaty in Washington. And beyond that treaty are deeper cuts to the mutually verifiable. That's a solid American position. When I went to meet with Assad, I brought Goodman back home and did not leave a cake or Bible with him. When I met with Fidel Castro, I brought Americans back home and Cubans back home and got him to agree publicly to the Contadora process, and took him to church for the first time in 30 years, reduced church-state tensions, and got him to agree to accept Mariel prisoners back. So when you move away from the hype about perception, my positions are very solid positions, and our party and our nation are moving in that direction.
Mr. Chancellor.
I have to limit this now because we really are running out of time. One for Mr. Gore, one for Mr. Dukakis. Mr. Dukakis.
John, I don't even know what the labels mean anymore. We have an administration in Washington that calls itself conservative, hasn't been able to balance a budget for 7, now 8 years. Many of us, at least 2 of us on this platform, have balanced budgets 8, 9, 10 years in a row. We're supposed to be liberals, and those folks are supposed to be conservatives. The most conservative principle in the history of mankind is something called the rule of law. It's a very conservative principle. I know, we got it from the Greeks. It's a very important principle. And this administration doesn't give 2 hoots about the rule of law, and it calls itself conservative for redefinition of terms. I think those of us on this stage believe in some very important conservative principles, like balancing budgets and respecting the rule of law, but we're also progressive. We care about people, and we believe in a very active role for political leaders. It's a very different view of these labels that people throw around.
The nominee we select will pose that question to the American people. We lost 49 out of 50 states last time, 47 out of 50 the time before that, 49 out of 50 2 times before that. And I think one of the messages that our party ought to look at from that record is that, yes, the country is ready again for democratic leadership in favor of economic growth, fiscal responsibility, social justice, but the American people want to see a Democratic nominee who understands the need for a strong American role in the world. The tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and John Kennedy included a commitment to internationalism, not withdrawing from a willingness to assert our principles and values in the world if it might involve standing up for them in a forceful way. Now, since the Vietnam War, we have been seen by the American people as pulling away from that internationalist tradition.
We Democrats?
Yes, we Democrats have been in those elections that I cited as pulling away from that tradition. And I believe that in order to serve the country well, in order to provide the leadership we need, and the kind of leadership America must provide to the world, we have to return to those traditions and say, look, we want to play a strong role in the world. We want to go back to those roots. And that's one of the messages that I've been trying to deliver throughout this campaign. I think it's important.
No, we've got to move on, gentlemen. We've got students waiting here to ask questions, and I don't want to leave them out. Mr. Gephardt, I went out in the parking lot here at the University of New Hampshire this morning, and I counted 10 different makes of foreign cars here in 5 minutes. There was a Mitsubishi with a heart sticker on it, there was a Volvo with a Babbitt sticker on it, and there was a Hyundai with a license plate that said, "Live free or die."
I hope there was a Chevrolet with a Gephardt.
Well, I didn't find one. Now, foreign cars are popular in this country because they're well made, and you told David Frost that Japan makes better cars than America. You said that the fit and finish was better, that the doors went ka-chunk when they slammed, and that there were more gizmos. Whatever gizmos may be. Now, seriously, how are Americans going to react if the Gephardt Amendment forces up the price of the imported cars and other things, a $48,000 Hyundai? Where is the free choice for the consumers in that? You want to solve the problem of trade by forcing people to limit themselves only to American products when you yourself have called some of those products inferior.
Well, John, I don't think you understand my policy and what I'm trying to do and what we need to do. The status quo on trade is not working. And the status quo has gotten us into a situation where our market is relatively open and other markets are relatively closed. And the whole purpose of my trade policy is to try to move us into a changed situation where we can really break foreign markets open, and to do it in a way that's different than what we're doing today. What do we do today? When we have a complaint about an unfair trade practice, we go to the International Trade Commission, we bring a case, we finally get a judgment, and when it's all done, we might have a remedy, and the other side might live with that remedy. And so it's commodity by commodity. And the fact is, it hasn't worked and it won't work. What's my trade policy? I say if you have a pattern of unfair trade practices, that the president should negotiate for 6 months with the country that has that pattern of practices. And if the president can't get movement, the president has the option of bringing across-the-board penalties against their products coming here. Now, what's the evidence? The evidence is that when we have stood up, other countries open up. Japan on microchips, and now Canada across the board in the fairest, freest trade treaty that we've ever achieved. And the only reason we achieved it is because there was an effort in Congress called the Gephardt Amendment that let them know that the unfairness had to stop. And when we finally delivered that message, we got action. So it's a new policy. It's breaking the status quo. And let me say this about consumers. I welcome foreign products. We have to compete against them, no question about it. But it's got to be a two-way street. It's got to be a fair shake. That's the essence of this policy.
Everybody now has their hand up. Mr. Gore.
Yes, well,
then
when
Mr.
I spoke
Babbitt.
about the tradition of internationalism before and being involved with the world, protectionism is again a retreat from that democratic tradition. Of course, we have to have strong leadership from a president who will negotiate the removal of unfair barriers. But to have an automatic formula that triggers a trade war because of some external cue based upon bilateral, exactly even trade balances, that's nonsense. You know, we've built up a $500 to $600 billion external debt during the Reagan administration. We've gone from being the largest creditor to the largest net debtor. And one consequence is, in the next decade, we will have to run very large trade surpluses. We must once again stand out and up for free trade on a fair basis. Now, we must also recognize that our economic policies are a major part of the problem. We've got to stop borrowing $500 million every 24 hours, and we've got to halt the decline in productivity growth that has extended over a long time.
All right. Mr. Babbitt.
Dick, I've got some good news for you. Excuse me, I'm trying to be too persuasive here.
You've lost your voice.
out in Iowa somewhere. I've got some news for you. Al Gore is a protectionist too.
Wrong.
Al Gore is advocating an oil import fee, which is another form of protectionism. And I think both of you have the wrong worldview.
First of all, I haven't said that. I haven't said that.
Protectionism. You advocate. I'll give you time to deny it, Al. I want you to deny it in front of everybody in Texas who's watching. Now,
I say it in New Hampshire.
The problem, very briefly, is this. Your view of the world is pessimistic. You believe that America can't compete and that we have to put up protective walls around this country. I see a very different world. I see a world in which America is winning, in which our market economics are taking root all over the world, across Asia, across the Pacific, in which we're now on the threshold of an American century. And in the hour of victory, you and Al want to surrender and say we're going to pick up our marbles and go home. I just think you're wrong. I think in the hour of victory, we should take yes for an answer and say we're going to lead the world, and we're going to do it without protectionism.
I'm going to see if I can get a Democrat to say something in 15 or 20 seconds.
You lose, John. We have to do a whole series of things on trade, including putting one person in charge instead of having 18 agencies. But where Dick and I differ, I think we have to ask ourselves, how did we get into this? Trade deficit and budget deficit. It was that 1981 Reagan tax bill that did it, that I voted against, that you voted for. Yesterday,
Paul,
yesterday.
Paul, if you had helped us, wait a minute.
Let
Wait a
me,
minute.
John.
Paul, wait a
John,
minute.
can I have the floor here?
No.
All right.
Taking my time.
Yesterday, Dick, your people put out a sheet of paper attacking me for my votes in 1981 on the tax bill. Talks about your opposition to the Reagan tax program. Well, now my understanding of opposition is you vote no instead of yes.
But
And
Paul,
maybe,
Paul, we had an alternative called the Mo Udall alternative, which was the Democratic alternative.
Well, that
It was the liberal alternative to the Reagan bill. And I worked hard to get the votes to pass it. You voted against it.
You're restructuring history, John. Let me just
No, we're
point
not
out what happened.
restructuring anything.
There was what was called a
answer.
Democratic alternative. It got to be an auction. And both bills got to be very, very
Paul,
bad.
what
And
about
then
the
there was a
Udall
third
bill?
one.
What
There was-
about the real
Wait a minute.
And
alternative?
the third one was the third one was a much better one, but it also called for tax cuts that would head us toward bigger and bigger deficits and bigger trade deficits. I voted against all three, and I'm proud to have done that.
And you were wrong.
No, I'm not going to do it. We have to go on. Gentlemen, we're just going to be here all day, and the network will switch off. They'll put on Jake and the Fat Man, and where will you be then? Mr. Dukakis.
The Vice President will be watching, Jim.
That's right. Mr. Dukakis, you talk about tax amnesty, stricter enforcement of tax collections that might bring in $35 to $50 billion a year. You probably saw this, but I'm not sure everybody in our audience read it. In the New York Times, there was an article that said half a dozen experts in Congress, the Treasury, and major accounting firms agreed in interviews that granting tax scofflaws a temporary amnesty and beefing up enforcement would generate some revenue, but they doubted it would raise even a tenth of what Mr. Dukakis has suggested. Now, there is criticism, and I know you're aware of it, that you were not bold enough to go for something that would raise some big money, mandatory withholding of taxes on interest and dividends. Would you address yourself to those 2 points?
Well, let me begin, John, by saying that no serious candidate for the presidency can rule out new taxes, and I haven't. But if I have to go to the Congress and ask for new revenue, it will be on the basis of the ability to pay. It won't be an oil import tax. It won't be a national sales tax. It hits the little guy and hits the middle class. I don't know who these economists are, but I can tell you that we've had at least a couple of very responsible and thorough studies in the last 6 months, one of them chaired by a distinguished member of the Congress who happens to be a supporter of Dick's, and was a former tax commissioner of the state of North Dakota. Each of those studies say that we can raise billions and billions of dollars by going out and collecting what the Treasury says is over $100 billion in taxes owed on legitimate income that are not being paid in this country. Now, we may have to impose new taxes, but I am at a loss to understand why we should, in fairness to the American taxpayer, most of whom pay their taxes and pay them on time, why we should impose additional taxes on them before we go out and make a good faith effort to collect these taxes. Many states, including my own, have done it. We've had spectacular success at doing it, and I think we know why we have this wide tax gap. These across-the-board cuts the Congress and the President have been approving have affected the Internal Revenue Service as well. We're doing 60% fewer audits today than we did in the mid-'70s. No wonder we have nearly 20% of the business and individual taxpayers in this country who are not paying the taxes they owe. Now, in fairness to honest taxpayers in this country, that's where you go first before you ask the Congress for new taxes.
Two people have reserved comment on this. One is Mr. Babbitt, the other is Mr. Hart, and then we press on to the last question. Mr. Babbitt.
Mike, when you get into that line about, I won't raise taxes ever, except as a last resort, that's really code language. That's code language for a statement that I don't have the courage to produce a real budget. Yeah, you just said that. You just said that.
I didn't say ever. I said,
you only said I will never raise taxes.
I said no serious
except as a last resort.
No, I think it's very important that we be accurate.
That was hyperbole. I said never 3 times, and you only said it once.
So you take it back.
The importance of this is simply that this budget deficit is not just a fiscal issue. It ultimately goes to an issue of candor and truth-telling about the future of America, and whether or not candidates, all of us, have the guts and courage to stand up and say, we've got a great future, but we've got to deal with these issues honestly. We've got to speak up to the American people, and it's incumbent upon us to talk about what kind of expenditure cuts we'd make,
And I've done
and
that. And I've done
what kind
that, right?
of revenues we'd raise.
And I've done that.
Because if we don't do that,
Right.
we don't deserve to be elected.
But you agree that the first thing we ought to do is go out and insist that all Americans, not just most of us, pay our taxes, don't you? Don't
Mike,
you agree with
I
that?
did that in my state, but you see, you're
Well, I'm
flim-flam.
talking about nationally.
You're, sure.
20%
But
of
Mike,
the
it's
business.
flim-flam to say you're going to balance the budget by hiring more revenue collectors. I mean, even Paul Simon's Public Works program isn't going to hire enough revenue collectors to balance the budget.
20% of the business and individual taxpayers, 1 out of every 5 taxpayers in this country, isn't paying the taxes he or she or it owes, and you're telling me that the first thing you do is impose taxes on the rest of it.
Mike,
That doesn't make any
I'll make
sense
you-
to
I'll
me
make
at
you
all.
Hold on.
I'll
It doesn't make any
Wait a
sense to
minute.
me at all.
We're not going to have any time left. Senator, Mr. Hart.
Mike, if you don't know yet that to balance this budget, you're going to have to raise some additional taxes, then it seriously calls into question your understanding of the situation. You can't wait till after you get in the White House. Bruce Babbitt's exactly right. The people of this country deserve to know, as I have tried to do, where the money is coming from. It's not a question of first, second, or third. We need some Reagan taxes. Let's give Ronald Reagan the credit for it.
And Gary, you want to impose an oil import tax.
Yes, and it is
and on the-
protectionism.
on the broad
and
middle
it's to
class,
protect
it's
the young,
protectionist.
it's to protect the young men of this country from losing their life in a war in the Persian
And it's
Gulf.
protectionist, and it's regressive, and there are dozens of ways to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. What you're telling me is that there's billions and billions of dollars out there in uncollected taxes. You and the Congress and the President, for whatever reason, haven't had the will to go out there and do it, but you want to impose regressive taxes on people before we go out and
No,
insist
what
that
I want to do is
everybody
avoid
costs
an
it.
unnecessary war in the Persian Gulf, and it won't demonstrate American strength, Al.
Mr.
Well, the first thing you do is go
Hart.
out and collect taxes owed that aren't being paid to this country. It's
Mr.
very
Hart,
unfair.
changing, neck-wrenching change of subject if we're going to move on. They are going to build a big computer complex out in Colorado Springs to simulate Star Wars battles, to see if it's technically possible for a missile defense to work, or to see if the Russians could overcome it at a lower cost to the Soviet Union. Now, you've been critical of SDI, but wouldn't this project help us find out if Star Wars will work, and are you for it?
Well, I don't know about this specific project. What I'm for is continuing research that was going on before Ronald Reagan and Edward Teller discovered Star Wars. All of us who served in the Congress know that routinely, year after year, for much of a decade, and in very secret ways, very classified ways, we were pursuing research on lasers, particle beams, X-ray lasers, computer linkages and studies, and that went on, and all of us supported it. Now, Ronald Reagan meant to change the fundamental defense doctrine of this country, was entranced with all this high technology, and threatens, I think, our alliance in NATO by suggesting we can put an umbrella over this nation and leave them to their own devices. Star Wars is a bad idea. What we ought to go back and do is continue the research at the level we were doing it, and it may include some computer simulation. But the issue isn't that individual program. The issue is the security of this nation. And Star Wars does not offer greater security for this country.
Mr. Gore had his finger
Well,
up. Very briefly, please.
Research at a low level within the anti-ballistic missile treaty is one thing and advisable, but the kind of project that President Reagan has proposed is nonsense. They briefed the Armed Services Committee recently on the latest version. They want to put 2,000 orbiting platforms in space, each of them capable of computing, defending itself, and firing projectiles at Soviet missiles. I asked the question, will one of those platforms cost as much as a spy satellite? If it does, you multiply that cost times the number they want to orbit, and it comes to $1.5 trillion. Their response was, no, you're wrong. It's going to cost only a fraction of the cost of a spy satellite because we've planned a whole series of scientific breakthroughs over the next few years, one by one. Well, it's nonsense, and we need to get back to a reasonable, low-level research program within the ABM treaty.
10 seconds. Because
Wait a minute,
your
10
question-
seconds is okay. I'll time it.
Your question suggested that the Colorado Springs connection, let me just say that has nothing to do with it. I led the fight against the MX missile, and the prime contractor was in Colorado.
No, I was just identifying it for the audience that read about it. Can you do it in 10 seconds? That'll
No,
help.
but I'll try. Implicit in that question is he should trade off short-term jobs for long-term insecurity. Whether it's short-term environmental hazards just for a job. We must make some fundamental decisions. We cannot exchange jobs for toxic waste, jobs for SDI. We can have jobs, peace, and justice if we choose a direction that's clear and sound and coherent.
Okay.
10 seconds.
All right, well, maybe we're getting some discipline into this crowd. Go ahead, I'll time it.
What we need to do is use the creativity we apply to weapons and apply it to the peace process, and this world is going to be infinitely safer for all of us.
Thank you. Now, we are going to go. The first question from the students here at the University of New Hampshire is from Dan Fasciano of Boston, Massachusetts.
My question is for the Reverend Jackson. Sir, it is difficult for some to evaluate your qualifications for President of the United States since you have no experience in public office at either the local, state, or national levels. Your most prominent claim as an administrator is your 15-year-old civil rights program, PUSH. In the past, the program has been plagued with financial difficulties, indicating millions of dollars of debt, late audits, and criticisms by the U.S. Department of Education for failing to account for federal funds. Through all this, you have repeatedly been quoted as saying, "I'm a tree shaker, not a jelly maker." I presume this means you provide the inspiration needed to initiate programs, but feel no responsibility for following through with them. Thus, it appears as if you're asking the American people to vote for you as a symbolic gesture, rather than one based on your ability to effectively govern the nation. Given your hands-off administrative attitude and lack of electoral experience, how can you expect to be effective with the Congress and the executive bureaucracy?
Let me unravel some of that. First of all, the first qualification is a constitutional qualification. I'm not asking for an amendment to the Constitution. Second, there have been 4 presidents elected who had never been in elected office before. Thirdly, what does a president do except to lift the moral tone of our country, to set its domestic priorities in order and to put forth a foreign policy? That civil rights record of fighting for a public accommodations bill, a voting rights act, an open housing act, ending the war in Vietnam, educating America's youth as high on our priorities, that thrust of leadership has made America better. I did not have the platform of a government position from which to do it. I raised money from the meager resources of poor people to build an organization that still stands and continues to serve. Our program, PUSH, is not in debt. I'm not running a deficit. Ronald Reagan is. We have done more with less than anybody on the stage. I registered more voters with less money. In the real sense, my leadership is the reason why at least 2 senators are on the stage today. Leadership must be defined by the ability to make things happen, to use resources, and I've used my resources well. My domestic experience is broad. My foreign policy experience is substantial. Whatever Reagan has done to get us in debt or sleep, I could get us out the hole awake.
Mr. Gephardt.
Well, every candidate on this stage is better than all the Republican candidates put together. We have lived through 7 years of an administration that put the Constitution through the shredder. We've had a president who has had people with him in office who have given the words sleaze factor a new name and a new definition. And we have had people like the Attorney General who spends more time in the courtroom as a defendant than as a prosecutor. Now, that's the kind of leadership we've had for the last 7 years. I believe that any of us could do a far superior job than to what we've seen in the last 7 years on economic policy, on foreign policy, on being able to inspire and motivate the American people, on being able to lead the American government. And that's why in November of 1988, a Democrat is going to be put into the White House.
Mr. Gore.
Well, I think I agree that any Democrat would be better than any of the Republicans, certainly. I think it's appropriate, though, for the questioner to ask about experience. We're facing a set of almost unprecedented problems. I think experience of 12 years in both the House and the Senate is relevant. I offer that. I think the experience of serving in Vietnam, having 4 children, heading a private business, all of these are relevant. But non-governmental experience can and should be taken into account. Nevertheless, when you look at the budget deficit, the arms race, the unprecedented environmental problems we are challenged with, the healthcare crisis, the need to move forward toward social justice, I think it's time, after the experience of the last 7 years, to ask whether or not a candidate has the ability to work with the Congress and has the experience to understand the problems and find the solutions. So I think the question is appropriate.
Next question from Rachel Horn of Plymouth, Massachusetts.
My question is addressed to Congressman Gephardt. Congressman, you have proposed an amendment to a trade bill that would punish those countries which have a sustained trade surplus with the United States unless they reduce their surpluses by 10% a year. Our principal problem seems to be with Japan, but for 1987, the rate of increase of European and Asian exports to Japan was 3 to 5 times that of the United States. The problem is not that Japan is closing its doors to the U.S. more than any other country, but that Europe and Asia are increasing their markets by improving their product quality and marketing techniques, and by getting the support of their banks. My question to you is this: why doesn't the United States try to improve its global markets in this way, rather than invoke protectionist measures that might invoke retaliation of its allies?
Well, first, I really do want you to read my trade bill because you didn't describe it correctly, and that often happens, and I'm not blaming you for it. But let me go back through it again so you understand it. First, we identify countries that both have huge surpluses with us and have a pattern of unfair trade practices against us. Then we ask the President to negotiate with them for over 6 months to try to begin to open those markets and stop those practices. If the President is not getting movement in the right direction, then the President is given the optional authority to bring penalties against their products coming here. So it's the stick in the closet to try to urge them to stop their practices. Now, you said a minute ago that there aren't many things that we can't get in other countries, but that's not our problem. Let me just cite some instances. Beef in Japan, our beef, is almost entirely excluded. They have a very high quota on it, and beef in Japan costs about $30 a pound. In some places in Tokyo, when you buy a pound of beef, they gift wrap it. We make cellular phones, mobile cellular phones in the United States. The Motorola people feel they could sell $1 billion worth of them in Japan and other markets this year, yet they're not allowed to sell one of them. Monsanto in my town makes silicon that goes on the silicon wafers that are the basic part of a computer. They can't sell 1 grain of it in many of the markets around the world. Well, time's up, the bell's rung. All I'm saying is we need a new approach. We got to stop the status quo. We got to open up our thinking on trade and figure out new ways to achieve that world common market that everybody wants.
We have requests from 4 of our participants for very brief comments. Please, Mr. Jackson.
There's something to be said about negotiating fair trade or to protect the integrity of free trade when there is an imbalance between our country and another government. Japan, we export more to Japan than we do to France, Britain, and Italy combined. So that through the GATT agreement, I am convinced we can resolve that. There's almost no focus, however, when Mr. Gephardt speaks of this, about the role of multinationals in this country. It's not so much that Taiwan and South Korea are taking jobs from us. Multinationals taking jobs to them. For example, the number 1 exporter from Taiwan is not Taiwan, it's GE, which GE owns RCA, which owns NBC, says buy in America while they take jobs from here, and made $6 billion and paid 0 taxes, $182 million tax rebate. We must address corporate rape by multinationals. We speak of free, fair, and reciprocal trade.
Mr. Hart.
The central new reality of our time is the involvement of the United States in the global market. We've not responded to that. My own trade policy is a reindustrialization policy of investment in the workers, the plants of this country, so we will be competitive. The worst old idea I've heard of in this campaign is protectionism. It will not work. It will penalize the farmers and the workers of this country and cost us jobs. It's just a bad idea, and we shouldn't do it. The President has the authority under existing law and agreement to enforce sanctions against unfair trade practices, and he won't do it. As President, I intend to.
Mr. Gore.
First, I want to compliment the questioner. I thought it was well-researched and thoughtful. I think you've obviously read the Gephardt Amendment. And really what's raised...
Al, he's from Plymouth, Massachusetts.
What's raised are... What your question raises...
Product of a great school system.
What your question raises are questions of balance and proportion. Nobody is saying that there are not unfair trade practices which must be removed. There are. Japan is about 20% open. We're about 65% open. Korea about 5%. Some other nations are more open than we are, but we're going to have to remove those barriers. However, every economist who's looked carefully at this problem says you are doing a disservice to the American people if you give the impression that the trade deficits largely result from these unfair trade practices overseas. They've got to be dealt with, but our overall economic policy and our approach to improving productivity here in the United States, those questions are more important. They have to be addressed at the same time as the unfair barriers and with more attention and more force and more imagination.
Mr. Simon.
It is a mosaic with a lot of pieces. The most important piece is having a president who understands trade and really moves. But since you're a student, I think we ought to say that one of the pieces in this is foreign language study. We're the only nation on the face of the earth where you can go through grade school, high school, college, get a PhD, never have a year of a foreign language. I used to be in business. There's a very simple rule in business. You can buy in any language. You want to sell, you have to speak the language of your customer. We don't speak the languages of our customers. You're going to have to help us.
Last word for Mr. Gephardt.
Gary, I agree that we have to be more productive, and everybody here would agree. Your trade bill basically is a bill to make us more productive, and I would agree with every part of it. But the question that's left unanswered by everybody is, what do we do in the modern world to change the lack of open markets? How do we change the status quo? How do we move on? I think I'm the only one that has described a way to actually go about it.
All right, now, I want to thank you all for that, and I'm sorry, I apologize to you for banging that little bell, but we do have more students to get to. We've got, perhaps, if we have time, a little general discussion on the state of the party and the state of the country, and I know there's nothing closer to your hearts than your closing statements, and we don't want to interfere with that. So now, because there are networks, parts of this PBS network that are waiting to break away just for a moment, possibly to raise $1 or $2. We will be back after a very brief break. Thank you.
You're watching C-SPAN, America's network. C-SPAN is a non-profit cooperative created and supported by the cable television industry as a public service for its national cable television audience. In addition, C-SPAN is underwritten in part by the following.
Tomorrow's doctor. She's very much on our minds today as we help expand the horizons of medicine and healthcare. We're DuPont, a major manufacturer of pharmaceuticals and diagnostics, dedicated to the discovery of better things for better living.
Next on C-SPAN, we return to the Democratic presidential candidates debate, sponsored this weekend by the New Hampshire Democratic Party.
In case you just turned in, you missed a pretty good show for the last hour. We've been discussing politics and programs with the 7 candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. We're at midpoint now here at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. And we are in the midst of some questions from students, written by the students themselves. Our next student is Tom Ailey of Grantham, New Hampshire. Tom?
Thank you. First of all, Governor Dukakis, I lived in Massachusetts too. We moved to New Hampshire, but
these days I love you just as much.
I know. Governor Dukakis, you have campaigned the results of the Massachusetts miracle and how it could be transferred to a stagnant national economy. However, you were initially against 3 significant factors that stimulated such growth. You were opposed to cutting tax rates, which your predecessor implemented. You were opposed to Proposition 2.5, which cut property taxes and drove down unemployment. And you were recently opposed to the continuing of many defense contracts, which employ a good deal of Greater Boston. My question to you is, how can you hope to export the Massachusetts miracle to other states when you oppose the very factors that led to such a miracle?
Well, I think you've got your history a little wrong, if I may say so, with all due respect. The Massachusetts turnaround began in the mid-'70s, not with a Reagan military buildup, and not with Proposition 2.5. We had enormous job growth from 1975 to 1978, 1979, and we've had tremendous job growth since 1983. And I would only urge you to take a look at who the governor was during those extraordinary periods of economic growth in Massachusetts history. It isn't that the Massachusetts miracle is instantly transferable to the nation, but there are things that have taken place in Massachusetts, things that are taking place at the state level all over the country, which I think we can learn from. Investing in economic development, and especially in regions that are hurting and hurting badly, investing in good schools and good training, investing in technology, investing in quality. I thought it was interesting when that question of quality came up about our goods, we immediately kind of dissolved into a debate over unfair trade practice. We've got work to do to reindustrialize this country, to improve manufacturing, to make ourselves competitive once again. And we've got to invest in those parts of the country, in Iowa, in northern Minnesota, in South Texas, in whole regions and communities in this country that are hurting and hurting very badly. We're doing very well here in New England, and we're very proud of that. But this is not a two-nation economy. This is one nation, and that is why the next president has to be somebody who brings strong fiscal and economic leadership to the White House. I believe I can do that.
Mr. Gore.
Well, I've heard Governor, first of all, I want to again compliment the questioner. I thought it was well researched. I can hardly wait for my question.
Moved to New Hampshire, but
these days I love you just as much.
I know. Governor Dukakis, you have campaigned the results of the Massachusetts miracle and how it could be transferred to a stagnant national economy. However, you were initially against 3 significant factors that stimulated such growth. You were opposed to cutting tax rates, which your predecessor implemented. You were opposed to Proposition 2.5, which cut property taxes and drove down unemployment. And you were recently opposed to the continuing of many defense contracts, which employ a good deal of Greater Boston. My question to you is, how can you hope to export the Massachusetts miracle to other states when you oppose the very factors that led to such a miracle?
Well, I think you've got your history a little wrong, if I may say so, with all due respect. The Massachusetts turnaround began in the mid-'70s, not with a Reagan military buildup, and not with Proposition 2.5. We had enormous job growth from 1975 to 1978, 1979, and we've had tremendous job growth since 1983. And I would only urge you to take a look at who the governor was during those extraordinary periods of economic growth in Massachusetts history. It isn't that the Massachusetts miracle is instantly transferable to the nation, but there are things that have taken place in Massachusetts, things that are taking place at the state level all over the country, which I think we can learn from. Investing in economic development, and especially in regions that are hurting and hurting badly, investing in good schools and good training, investing in technology, investing in quality. I thought it was interesting when that question of quality came up about our goods, we immediately kind of dissolved into a debate over unfair trade practice. We've got work to do to reindustrialize this country, to improve manufacturing, to make ourselves competitive once again. And we've got to invest in those parts of the country, in Iowa, in northern Minnesota, in South Texas, in whole regions and communities in this country that are hurting and hurting very badly. We're doing very well here in New England, and we're very proud of that. But this is not a two-nation economy. This is one nation, and that is why the next president has to be somebody who brings strong fiscal and economic leadership to the White House. I believe I can do that.
Mr. Gore. Well, I've heard Governor, first of all, I want to again compliment the questioner. I thought it was well researched. I can hardly wait for my question. But Governor Dukakis has seemed to say at times that since Massachusetts has a 2.9% unemployment rate, he ought to be president of the United States. Now, by that logic, New Hampshire has a 2.1% unemployment rate. Surely John Sununu should not be president of the United States. Now, when I hear the phrase Massachusetts miracle, I mean, I went to divinity school, and they have a tougher definition of the word miracle. But I don't want to be misunderstood. I think Mike Dukakis is a tremendous governor. He's been doing an outstanding job. I think he ought to stay right there as governor of Massachusetts.
Mr. Babbitt.
I want to tell you that statistically, over the last 5 years, Arizona has had the top-ranked economy in the entire United States, and that's why I should be president. I think this issue of better goods and quality is very important. And we don't get there by proposing federal grant programs. A $500 million grant program, a couple of $1 million in green checks for each state. That's not what economic renewal is about. I've talked about a concept called workplace democracy. It says that we must change the way we work in America. What's really wrong in America is the managers of General Motors. They cut employee wages, raise bonuses. People on Wall Street handing themselves golden parachutes while they hand out pink slips to employees. I think we need a fundamental change in the leadership to say we're going to begin listening to workers, involving them in the daily workplace, and rewarding them with profit sharing, employee stock ownership, saying we can put America back to work by listening to the people who do the work.
Mr. Simon.
Yes, I'm not against workplace democracy. I applaud Mike for what he has done.
Thank you, Paul.
I knew you'd appreciate that, Mike.
Working together, we can do great things for Illinois. You in the Senate, I in the White House.
But I think we have to realize that we have a problem in our country called the underclass that you're not going to be able to just tinker with to solve. That we're going to have leadership that is more than just tinkering to move on. And I have proposed, both with public sector jobs programs that screen people and lift them in the process, that we do something about it. And number two, that we recognize, Mike, you used the word quality, that we have quality schools all over this nation and quality education for our young people. And when we do that, when we have that double-barreled approach, then we're really going to do for this nation what we ought to do. We ought to be dreaming about the kind of a nation we can build, and we can do infinitely better.
Mr. Hart.
One of the big differences among the candidates is our attitude about change. What the question suggests is that we can bring miracles to the nation by incremental change. I think we have to have structural change. Mike's right in his use of the word invest, but I think that investment plan has to be more than just a little bit of change here and there. I talk about rebuilding the very foundation of this nation's economy, investing private dollars in our manufacturing base, investing public dollars in our infrastructure, as Paul says, to put people back to work, public and private dollars into our research laboratories, most of all, investing more in our education and job training system. The difference here, the Democratic Party is not going to win by just offering a little bit more of the same. We're going to have fundamentally different policies.
Mr. Jackson.
Well, first of all, the government should be congratulated for attempting to move in the right direction. But that miracle missed Roxbury. The alienation is so intense, and the people try to secede from the city. The poverty abounds, and
they voted against it, Judge.
People, they voted against it, but one must separate, it seems to me, the message from the language. You don't just judge effect by who won, who lost. The fact is there are pockets of poverty that missed the miracle. And what I'm suggesting is that any miracle must, target those who are the most disadvantaged as well. Secondly, when a Framingham closes, it's not your fault. It raises the question about the need for structural multinational policy that will begin to help allow a miracle to take place everywhere around the country.
Next question. The questioner from the student body here at University of New Hampshire is Jay Gould of Peabody, Massachusetts.
My question is directed to Senator Hart. Sir, since you began campaigning for president in 1983, you have been plagued by many controversies that have hampered your ability to spread your message to the American people. From your initial reports that you had changed your name and altered your age, to the details of your escapades in Bimini, and your recent admission of illegalities on your campaign finances, you personally have become the central focus of your campaign, and not the issues that you represent. I agree with you that everyone in this nation should have the right to lead a private life, but certainly a president's personal life plays a role in the development of that public trust. You say the American people have no right to know your private life, though it is clear that you have made judgments in that private life that have put yourself in compromising positions where blackmail could be attempted. Considering all you have said and done, my question is twofold. First, what can you say to the American people that will assure them for the future that you will not do anything in your private life that could open you up to blackmail? And second, why would the American people want to put their trust and faith in your ability and judgment as President of the United States?
Let me answer both those questions as briefly as I can. First of all, I think character is an issue and ought to be an issue in any national election or for any elected official. I have believed that all my life, and that's why I've tried my very best as a human being to live as good a life as I could. Not a perfect life by any means, not a life without error or mistake, but as good as I could, both in terms of my relationship with my wife and my children, and with those that I deal with, my friends and my colleagues. Let's talk about judgment, let's talk about character. Judgment, I believe, is knowing what's right, and character is having the courage to do it. Let me give you some examples. I fought against the Vietnam War at a time when others' judgments did not believe that that was a bad war, and I had the courage to fight against it. I mentioned that I had felt in my judgment that the MX missile was wrong, even though it was built in my own state. I think I had the courage and the character to fight against it. I fought against Reaganomics at a time when it was very popular. I think my judgment's been borne out. I had the courage to fight against it. The same is true of Gramm-Rudman. Let me just comment on campaign financing. I was the first presidential candidate not to take political action committee money. It's a major difference among us on this platform. I believe that money is corrupting American politics. I've been charged, I think recently, by anonymous sources with accepting illegal contributions. Now let me respond to that. That charge is false. Two anonymous people have said that two other anonymous people gave me the sum of $1,500 out of a campaign that raised about $9 or $10 million. I can't respond to ghosts. Those are very serious charges. I've run honest and scrupulous campaigns, and if anyone will step forward and tell me who the senior staff people were who had direct access to me, then I will respond to those charges. But I'm here to tell you they're absolutely false.
Mr. Babbitt.
I think the important character questions are issues of political character, of the nature of this political campaign. You see, that's why the deficit issue is so important, because ultimately it becomes not just a fiscal problem, but a question of a deficit of character, of courage, of truth. That's the problem in Washington, is the deficit of moral honesty on Wall Street, the the lack of fiscal integrity about the goals of this country. And that's why it is, I think all of you as students need to insistently ask your candidates, why aren't you speaking more directly to the economic issues that confront this country? Why don't you have some respect for our character as students by talking honestly to us and respecting our ability to make decisions about those kinds of issues? Mr. Gephardt.
All the issues are important, and I have great faith in the American people to decide among us and to make a good decision. But I must tell you that I have been disappointed in this campaign in the media's willingness to really put in front of the American people the kinds of issue discussions that we're having here today. When there's a poll taken, and there's one taken about every day in Iowa or New Hampshire, it's on the front page. And everybody's position in the poll is lined up numerically, and there's a graph, and everybody knows exactly where everybody is on that day. Where's the graph on where we all are on the oil import fee? Where's the front page story on where everybody is on trade? People deserve to know that. Where everybody is on Central America, where everybody is on education. I've been in thousands of meetings, everybody on this stage has, and I've talked to millions of people over television and in meetings, and all the questions I get, almost all the questions, are about where are you on the budget? Where are you on trade? What will you do with the Soviets? Where do you stand on the MX missile? And on and on. That's what the American people want to know, and I think they've gotten too little of it in this campaign, and I hope in the closing months here they'll get more of it.
Gee, I thought I'd ask you all those questions here this afternoon. I guess
you have, John. It's just that we always don't get that in all the media.
Well, we've got to press on. Our next questioner is Brett Clemens of Nashua, New Hampshire.
I have a question for Senator Simon. Senator Simon, like Ronald Reagan in 1980, you claim to want to balance the federal budget by your third year in office. Yet, some of the policies you've supported have actually shown that you might increase the budget deficit. You support a guaranteed job program that you've said would cost $5 billion the first year, $8 billion the second year, and even more after that. You support an extension of Medicare and said you would not touch Social Security. In addition, you would bring back the investment tax credit, which would have cost the federal government $24 billion in revenue last year. Despite all these budget increases, you say you will not raise taxes until a last resort. You also say you expect the economy to be stimulated by your guaranteed jobs program, even though such public works jobs do not significantly increase the tax base or contribute to industrial growth. So my question is, given the broken promises of the Reagan administration about balancing the budget, how can you convince the American people that your own economic program isn't just another twist on the supply-side economics theory, and that which has more than doubled the federal deficit in the last 7 years?
Okay, very good question, and it comes from obviously doing some research on your part. One of the differences between what Ronald Reagan said in 1980 and what I'm saying today is, number one, I have a record of not making promises I don't keep. That is one difference between us. Number two, I am in the federal government. I'm on the Senate Budget Committee. I was in the House Budget Committee. I know a little bit about it. And what I have said is we can, both with a 3-year program, by cutting back on Pentagon spending, by moving on the trade deficit, employing more people, putting more people in jobs, by starting that deficit down and then getting interest rates down, you can balance a budget if present projections are correct in 3 years, but I would, as a last resort, move to tax increases. I'm committed to stop borrowing from our children, our grandchildren. Then, within the budget, like you mentioned, the jobs program, $5 billion that's the gross cost, incidentally. Net cost would be appreciably less. That's 1/2 of 1% of the budget. We can find the money for that. It's a question of whether we accept the Reagan priorities. I don't accept them. I want to have different priorities that are much more caring and sensitive.
Mr. Jackson.
I think fundamentally what we ought to deal with and what Senator Simon is saying is not just details, but direction. When I reflect on Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal and antitrust legislation was a challenge in direction. Our profiles encouraged by John Kennedy demanding more of Americans, that we as a people be better. a great society by Lyndon Johnson, a government that cares. Brother Paul Simon says a government must no longer accept the premise that we are militarily weak and can't afford economic justice. Our government must take some initiative on raising the lot of people who are locked out and who are abandoned. And if we invest in people, people will make us a stronger and a better nation. The fundamental message of the Simon approach is that our government cannot just be characterized by guided missiles and misguided leadership. Our government must again have compassion because, frankly, Head Start and daycare, whatever they cost less than jail care and welfare.
Mr. Dukakis.
Brett, that leads to a very important point. I share Paul's feelings about people living in poverty, helping people to lift themselves out of poverty. But we've got to make some choices, given this deficit. And the question is, do we make work jobs, or do we help people get the training and the skills they need to get good jobs at decent wages and lift themselves permanently out of poverty and save money at the same time? Because every family you help to get off of welfare is a family that no longer needs public support. Now, there are states all over this country that have demonstrated that we can help thousands and thousands of welfare families to get the training they need to provide daycare for their kids and to help those welfare mothers become independent, self-sufficient citizens. That not only helps them in a much better way than make work jobs, but it saves money at the same time and helps cut the deficit. That's the kind of creative leadership
At
that
the
I think this
end, can we
country
come
needs.
back to you very briefly from Mr. Babbitt, and then Mr. Simon gets his revenge.
Paul, I'm not satisfied with either of these answers, because the ability to provide programs for sick children, for our parents, to further the progressive agenda, is going to require some tougher talk about how we cut expenditures and raise revenues. You see, that's the dilemma, because if we don't do that, it's just all window shopping. And that's why I advocate what I call a universal needs test. It's the opposite of Graham-Rudman. It says we'll have the courage to deny subsidies to corporate agribusinesses, to deny tax subsidies to people who are buying second homes. We'll structure programs on the basis of need, and then we will specifically raise revenues through a progressive national consumption tax which exempts low-income people, but undeniably says to all Americans, we have to make an investment in the future.
Brief last word from Mr. Simon.
2 quick points. One, make work jobs is a white-collar phrase that we use to really put down jobs that a lot of people would be very, very happy to have. We have a choice of paying people for doing nothing, paying them for doing something. I want to pay them for doing something. In response to my friend Bruce, we have to do something other than impose a sales tax on middle and low-income people. We have to do something other than say we're going to solve this problem by taking it out on people with Social Security. We can find better answers than that, I can assure you.
Last word. Now a question from Wendy Hammond of Rochester, New York.
Yes, my question is directed to Senator Gore. Senator Gore, you have repeatedly voiced your opposition to any military aid to the Contras, and you have denounced the terrorist tactics the Contras have waged on the Nicaraguan people. Yet, in a televised debate, and again when you spoke here at the University of New Hampshire last fall, you declared your support for non-military aid to the Contras. I'm sure, Senator, that you must realize that by supplying the Contras with so-called humanitarian aid, other funds are thus freed up to purchase weapons and arms for the Contras so that they can continue their terrorist attacks. In fact, the term humanitarian aid is simply a ploy used by the Reagan administration to hide the fact that any aid, no matter what it's called, goes to help fight the war effort. Thus, why should the American people perceive your stance on aid to the Contras as anything but your own political ploy to appeal to as many voters as possible?
I knew I would feel a new sympathy with my colleagues up here I have never supported a non-military aid to the Contras proposed by the Reagan administration. I've always voted against military aid to the Contras of any kind, and I have almost always voted against so-called humanitarian or non-military aid to the Contras, precisely because of my concern that they might be able to do what your question suggests, divert it into military uses. There have been 2 or 3 occasions when Democrats have put forward an alternative in the Congress. The Democratic leadership on one occasion, Senator Joe Biden on another occasion, my colleague from Tennessee, Senator Jim Sasser, on a third occasion, which would be non-military aid at extremely low levels with tight safeguards to prevent the diversion, and one other critical qualification. In all 3 of the instances I refer to, it has been a part of the Arias Plan, designed to further the Arias Plan by, for example, resettling the Contras as part of the peace process. Now, they're going to be resettled either in Nicaragua or in Florida. And President Arias has said on several occasions that aid of that sort is consistent with the plan. Interestingly enough, the Sandinistas themselves said just 3 days ago that if there is a ceasefire, then they themselves would support and allow humanitarian aid of a specific kind. I think we've got to avoid just passing litmus tests and trying to further the peace process there by supporting the Arias Plan.
And how would you plan to vote on February 4th if it did go through the House on February 3rd, and there was, with the ceasefire, that stipulation, and 90% of that aid would be humanitarian?
If it contains any military aid at all, I will vote against it. I think the Contra war is wrong. If it contains humanitarian aid without safeguards so that it can be diverted, I will vote against it. If it contains that third category I referred to, you know what President Arias himself said? He was asked that question, and he said, let's wait a couple of weeks and see whether or not the Sandinistas live up to the pledges they made. You know, 6 months ago, we addressed this question, and all right, Arias has the right idea. I support his approach.
Mr. Babbitt. Al, that's a long way around. We've been doing this, having this same discussion for 6, 8 months, a year, and it's just time to walk straight up and say we're going to terminate Contra aid, period, without any reservations. Why? Because it's a dead-end policy.
That's now to the left of the Sandinistas, incidentally.
Well, President Arias has said unequivocally, terminate Contra aid, because you see the future of Central America lies elsewhere. It lies in the other 5 countries, in Mexico. And we've got to get off this obsession with Nicaragua and understand it. That's 2 million people. Mexico, 83 million people. And what the Arias peace plan is really about is momentum, motion, turning the wave of economic development and trade and economic integration outward to those other countries. So the answer simply is Contras no, development, Arias sí.
Mr. Hart. Perhaps uniquely on this platform, I think Al and I share a common perception that the Democratic Party is not going to win unless people believe we've got a perception of the world in which we live that is realistic and in which we are going to be engaged and involved. Now, the difference is that Al, to prove his, quote, strength, adopts too many elements, I think, of Reagan foreign policy. And I disagree with his suggestion that those who don't go along with sending Marines to Lebanon or invading tiny islands in the Caribbean are weak and without a commitment to the use of military force. What I've tried to do in my foreign policy is spell out criteria which I, as president, would use to check against before I send American troops anywhere. You can't ad hoc this. And the fundamental disagreement that I think Al and I have is that he says, well, I would do it here and I wouldn't do it there, and I would intervene here and I wouldn't do it there. I think each person on this platform ought to spell out the criteria that they would use as president for the use or non-use of American military force.
You know, Gary, if we had followed your advice, and imposed a moratorium on deployments of medium-range missiles in Europe, a process which President Jimmy Carter began and which the current administration continued in a bipartisan spirit, we wouldn't have the INF treaty now, and the Soviet SS-20s would not be on the verge of being removed. You can't just withdraw from the rest of the world, abandon our allies. You propose stopping the deployment of those missiles in Europe, which was part of a 2-track process to get a peace treaty removing the Soviet missiles. Now, luckily, we stayed the course, And we have now gotten,
Sounds
thanks
very
to Jimmy
Reagan-esque,
Carter
Al.
and the continuation of the policy, a peace treaty that will remove the Russian missiles and our missiles.
John?
Well, wrong.
Wrong. What? No, you can't get in. He can. I've just got to close it off somewhere. I'm sorry, Mr. Simon.
The fact is, the president has said the Contras are in the field to get to a negotiation. This president has rejected every opportunity to go to negotiate. And if we vote to give him humanitarian aid, lethal aid, any kind of aid, we are simply falling into his trap. He wants to militarily defeat the Sandinistas, and he won't be satisfied with anything else. And I hope you'll stay with the position that we've had in the House that you voted for many times.
Last word. Now we hear from Wendy Hannon of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Wendy?
This question is addressed to Governor Babbitt. It's your chance to speak economics. You have presented a detailed program for reducing the federal budget deficit by $80 billion a year for the next 5 years. The criticisms of this plan are as follows. First, your proposal to institute a 5% national consumption tax, or sales tax, would increase the cost of goods, possibly creating inflation and pushing interest rates even higher. Secondly, the sales tax would reduce consumption, the major contributor to current economic growth, thus further undermining the economy. And third, the cumulative multiplier effects of collecting $80 billion from taxes and spending cuts would result in an estimated withdrawal from the economy of $200 billion each year, an amount equal to almost 5% of the gross national product. My question is this. By insisting on such drastic measures, are you not simply trading off the budget deficit for a severe economic recession?
Wow, are you an economics student?
You got it.
Listen, it's a good question. The importance of this deficit can't be underestimated. It seems to me that if we care about the long-term growth of the United States of America, if we care about your future, we have to throw away that government credit card and quit sending the bills to your generation. Now, the only way we can do that is to start getting honest about what most of this campaign has not been honest about, which is, how do you do that? Now, first of all, you make cuts, and I've explained that those cuts have to be progressive. They have to be in accordance with the liberal tradition. You preserve the programs that are necessary through the use of needs testing. And then you have to bite the bullet of raising revenues. Now, the candidates here have not been eager to do that. And they've spent their time feeding me the kinds of questions that you're feeding me now. Let me respond to them. First of all, it will be a progressive tax. Poor people will not pay it. The average tax with a progressive consumption tax on middle-income Americans would be about $1 a day. Upper-income taxpayers would pay 10 times as much. That's progressive. What are its economic effects? Any inflationary effect would, I believe, be offset by the fact that you would have a stimulus to savings and consumption. So the bottom line is simply this. Ask Lester Thoreau, ask the economists, and they'll tell you what I'm saying to you right now, which is your future requires that we be honest about raising revenues, and this is the best way to do it. Mr. Gore.
Well, your figures, I think, are correct, and we've got to focus on the regressive nature of a national sales tax.
Al, I just told you it wasn't regressive.
I know you said
I just told
it wasn't,
you poor people would be exempt.
You can say these red lights are ducks. It doesn't make them ducks.
Well,
a sales tax is by nature.
Read my plan.
A sales tax is by nature regressive.
My plan is not. My plan is not.
Listen, you say it's not regressive.
Let me tell you how I exempt.
Mr. Moderator,
Can I tell you how I exempt it?
Let me get my point out first, okay?
And then
you
I'll
just want to
respond.
repeat the word progressive over and over again, but by its nature, a sales tax is inherently regressive. Anybody who's studied taxing systems will tell you that's one of the first rules of taxation. Now, it's supposed to be made progressive by rebating it on income taxes to the poor. An awful lot of poor people don't even file tax returns. We just added 6 to 7 million new people in the category that do not have to file tax returns. If you put a national sales tax on the American people, you are adopting a Republican regressive idea. It's a mistake.
Now, wait a minute. That's across the line. I spent time in the streets of Selma, Alabama in the Civil Rights Movement, and nobody came and questioned my credentials as a Democrat. I spent time working in the slums of South America.
I said a sales
Nobody
tax is a
questioned my
Republican idea.
credentials as a Democrat. I was the progressive governor of a conservative state. And I just think it's across the line to walk up and respond by implying that kind of talk. Nobody's ever questioned my credentials
Well, don't
as a
put out a
Democrat.
Republican idea then.
Have you finished? Mr. Jackson.
It seems to me the fundamental challenge is that the 1981 tax cut was too excessive. It means we're going to have to re-raise some revenue. The top 400,000 individual high-income earners, if at the 38% bracket, that's $20 billion and they can afford to pay it. If corporations pay the 1980 level of taxes, that's $20 billion, and the incentive ought to be to reinvest in America, retrain, reindustrialize, and research. That should be the incentives for the money. If Europe will better share the burden of its own defense, and then those missile systems that are unnecessary, if they do not go forward. Last one I was supposed to be the 2 aircraft task forces, another $40 billion. We got 13, the Russians got 1. We must bite the bullet, but let's take on those who are the chief beneficiaries of the arrangement that now has us in the hole. The fact is, people who are buying their daily wares did not put us in this hole. Let's challenge the rich, the powerful, and the military excesses.
All right. Thank you very much, all of you, for those questions. I do thank the students who worked very hard on the research and everything else that went in. Too hard. Too hard. We have a couple minutes left before we go to your closing statements, which begin with Mr. Jackson. I want to broaden this out a little bit. We see the Soviet Union tinkering with capitalist ideas. We see China fiddling around with capitalism, and even the Vietnamese the other day said they might put a little more capitalism into their system. And the Russians seem to have changed character a little bit. I don't care who starts answering. I'd like to get all of you to comment on it. Is the Cold War over and we don't know it?
Yes.
Mr. Gould.
No. No, it is not over. A couple of people have said the Cold War is over, but you can't tell that to the people of Afghanistan. You can't tell that to the people in Eastern Europe. You can't tell that to Jewish families in the Soviet Union who are trying to leave the Soviet Union. The fact is, nevertheless, we are winning the battle of ideas that we have had with the communist system for most of this century. Their adoption of a new approach around the margins is an acknowledgement that the market system has benefits that their system simply cannot provide. They are scared to death at the progress being engineered in China by their change under Deng Xiaoping toward a more market-oriented economy. We are winning the battle of ideas, but to jump from that to the conclusion that the Cold War is over and we no longer have to be concerned about the underlying conflict would be a very serious mistake. We are in a transition period when we need sound leadership to exploit opportunities, but to keep our guard up.
Briefly, gentlemen, we're getting close to your final statements. Mr. Simon.
I think it's the wrong question, John. I think the question is, do we have an opportunity now for an improved relationship with the Soviet Union because of the new leadership? And I think the answer is we do. We have to go into it with our eyes wide open, but we ought to do that. And if I can add one 10-second item that Gary and I are interested in, the Soviet ambassador of France announced apparently yesterday that a refusenik that Gary and I had been fighting for by the name of Naum Maiman is going to be released. I hope if anybody from the Soviet embassy is watching this, we expect you to follow through and release Naum Maiman.
Mr. Babbitt, quickly.
The reason the Cold War is winding down is because Marxism is dead. In your generation coming up, we're seeing an ascendancy and a triumph of market values all over Asia, across the Pacific. Marxism is dead. It's the singular fact of this century. Now, of course, Leninism is not dead, but Gorbachev understands that Marxism is dead. That leads to the explanation of why it is he's trying to shake up his own society. We're winning. And what we have to do is formulate a foreign policy and an international economic policy on the understanding that Marxism is a failure. Our values are sweeping the world, and we ought to start acting like the winners that we are.
Mr. Gephardt, quickly.
I think we're asking the wrong questions. It's not, is glasnost for real or is the Cold War over? I think we stop trying to psychoanalyze the other party and we go to the table. I'm from Missouri. We have a motto, show me. Let's have a president who goes to the table and sees if it's for real and what can be accomplished. I happen to believe a lot can be accomplished. It is a window of opportunity. Let's get on with it. Let's have a president that doesn't fall asleep during the negotiation.
Mr. Dukakis.
And at the same time we're doing that, John, let's be true to our own values. Let's respect the law in Central America and stop that failed and illegal policy. Let's do something about 2 million homeless families in the streets of our cities, because that's what America's all about. Let's create good jobs for those people in cities and in rural counties all over this country. Let's be true to our own values as we pursue what probably is the best opportunity to stop the arms race and to get meaningful arms control and arms reduction we've had in our lifetime.
Mr. Hart, very quickly, please.
Cold War is becoming irrelevant, and Mr. Gorbachev is smart enough to know that, and our president is not. I'm not sure everyone in our party is smart enough to know that. We can continue to try to fight a war that is becoming less important to the people of the world and exhaust ourselves in the process, but I think uniquely or alone among the candidates here, I've talked to Mr. Gorbachev. My strong impression is this man knows that the world is changing, and he's changing with it, and we are not.
Mr. Jackson?
Fundamentally, we've had to decide to choose coexistence over co-annihilation. That's the end, and this arms race represents more danger for both sides and more moral and economic bankruptcy for both sides. And we're moving in another direction. And what was significant to me was not only did Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev sign an agreement, we're looking forward now to deeper cuts, mutually verifiable, but just beneath that, meeting with American business people to expand and exchange trade. Those are steps in the right direction. Now, for this generation of youth, they should begin to exchange universities so as to open up their minds and know that peace is possible and a mutual imperative.
I want to thank you all for that. Those feelings on is the Cold War over? I'm not sure if it is or not. I do know that the time has come for each of you to give us a 2-minute closing statement, and we would like to begin that process with Mr. Hart.
I re-entered this race for 2 reasons. One, because as this country begins its 3rd century, this contest is too important to leave it up to conventional politics and traditional solutions. I put forward ideas for the past 5 or 10 years in a book that direct us towards investment, reform, and engagement. These are basically fundamentally different policies. Investment in the very foundation of this nation's economy to rebuild it. Reforming our conventional forces so they are the backbone of our nation's defenses as we drastically reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons. And engagement in a new world, a world of new realities, of global marketplace, of nationalism and dispersed power. I call that policy enlightened engagement. But I also got back in because I think this contest is a test of courage. 3 days after I entered the race, the Washington Post said, Hart can't win. Well, I'll fight to the death for that newspaper or any other newspaper's right to its own opinion and to be able to print that opinion. What that paper doesn't have the right to do is to tell you how to vote or for whom to vote. This issue is one for the people. I think the people of New Hampshire care enough about democracy to walk across the street and vote. If you do, we will all win, and I need your help. I believe we should let the people decide. I think you should decide.
Mr. Simon.
Those who wrote our Constitution had a dream of a more perfect union. A few days ago, we honored the birthday of someone who shared in that dream, Martin Luther King. And a few days ago, we also noted the 10th anniversary of the death of someone else who shared that dream, Hubert Humphrey. Those of you who are students, that name may not mean that much, but he had the idea for the Peace Corps, for help to the handicapped, and a great many other things. And we're richer for the dreams of both of these people. Hubert Humphrey spoke to the House about 8 weeks before he died. He knew he was dying, and we knew he was dying. It was one of the most moving experiences in my years in politics. In that address, he had no formal prepared address, but among other things, he said this: so far as we know in this whole vast universe, the only place where God has given life is this small planet of the Earth. You and I are engaged in an experiment whether we can have peace and freedom and justice and opportunity on that small planet. My friends, that's what the ball game is really all about. We need leadership that cares, that dreams, that dares, that leads. And if you want that more perfect union, if you want the kind of leadership that dreams and cares and leads, I stand ready to serve as your president.
Mr. Gore. Thank you, Mr. Chancellor, and thanks to these students, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this debate as much as I have. We've talked about the issues here this afternoon. It's not always that way. There's sometimes a tendency to talk about primaries and caucuses and the process, but politics is not just about process. It's not just about winning and losing and playing the game. Politics is about change. Politics is about our future. It's about whether or not we as a free people can understand clearly how high the stakes are in this election. Politics is about whether or not we'll find the ability to reinvigorate America's economy and halt what many fear is the decline of America's economic strength. Politics is also about whether or not we can reach down inside ourselves as human beings and feel compassion for the 50,000 AIDS cases that are all over this country, the hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, and families who are sleeping on the sidewalks and heating grates of every major city in this country. Politics is also about our children and whether or not we'll understand why it's so important to invest in the best education system in the entire world and clean up our environment and move towards social justice in this land. The Republicans are not offering any of that. They don't even understand that politics is about whether or not we're going to have the wisdom and leadership to seize what might be an unprecedented chance to halt and reverse the nuclear arms race. The Republicans are simply offering more of the same, a continuation of the Reagan-Bush blueprint. We can't offer the American people just tinkering around the edges. We have got to understand that that will no longer do. We are at a unique time in our history. Once Spain and England were dominant nations in the world. Where are they now? Some fear we are seeing the end of an American era. But together we can create a new American era. I look at my children and I wonder what that era will be like, but I know that working together, we can make a difference. We can create in this nation a future with hope, and I ask for your help to do just that.
Mr. Babbitt, my campaign has been different because I believe in the character of the American people. During the course of this campaign, I've said some things that you don't want to hear. And I've said some things that I really didn't want to say because they're not necessarily easy. But you and I both know they're true. I've said them because I believe that America has a tremendous future, that we can reignite growth, that we can provide opportunities for our children and education and compassionate care for people who need it, that we can once again lead the world. In order to do that, we have to talk honestly about issues like that budget deficit, about how it is we restructure the American workplace, to invoke your energy and your skills and to have you listened to and rewarded for the work that you do. I've talked about these things because I can't ask you to believe in me if I don't demonstrate that I really believe in you. Because you see, all through my life, my guiding principle in the streets of Selma, Alabama, in the slums of South America, during my years as Attorney General, as the progressive governor of a conservative state, has been simply this. If you really believe in the people that you want to lead, anything is possible. Thank you.
Mr. Jackson, I found this to be an intriguing and rather exciting campaign, a lot of focus on economic growth. I'm concerned a lot about the growth of America's character. I have more leadership experience than anybody on the stage in social justice, in making America better, strengthening our national character. Whether fighting for public accommodations or the right to vote or open housing, or motivating our youth to shun drugs and babies making babies and violence, or fighting for peace in this world. My record is one fighting for social justice, and peace stands out. Let us not forget, as I hear the saying go, Jesse can't win. Everybody on this stage has been told you can't win. They say peace activists can't win, therefore surrender to war. Workers can't win, surrender to exploitation. Those fighting nuclear power plants can't win, surrender. Those who want minimum wage raised can't win, surrender. Those who want ERA passed, just surrender. Those who want to choose education and daycare over jail care and welfare, you can't win, just surrender. Well, I'm not going to surrender, and I don't want you to surrender, because what makes America America is the right to fight for the right and to overcome the odds. The fact of the matter is, apart, you cannot win. When I was a child growing up in South Carolina, my grandmother could not buy a blanket, couldn't get credit, but she didn't give up. She'd take patches and pieces, old clothes, coats and rags and dresses and slips. While they were apart, it could hardly be fit to wipe off your shoes. They couldn't win. An old woman would pull them together. She would turn those rags and patches and pieces into a quilt, a thing of warmth and power and beauty. Together, we can win. I stood with you to say no intervention in Central America. I stood with you to say no intervention in South Africa, to free South Africa. I stood with you to stand with AIDS victims October 11th. My friends, together, we can win and change the course of our nation for the better. God bless America, and God bless you.
Mr. Gephardt. The major challenge in this election is whether we as a people can regain control of our economic destiny. This is a great diverse country and issues vary from place to place, but the root causes of our concerns are the same. For example, the farmers in Iowa and the consumers in New Hampshire suffer from policies which take from them the most important decisions that people get to make. The farmers in Iowa and in the Midwest are losing their land because the vested interests run agricultural policy. And the consumers in New Hampshire are saddled with Seabrook because the nuclear industry has taken over the public interest. We've seen times like this before. After 2 terms of Coolidge and Harding, Franklin Roosevelt said we've endured 8 gray years. The 20s, like the 80s, have been a time when we have not taken care of human needs and when we've allowed established interests to go on a spree of greed. That's why we have a big trade deficit. That's why we're losing good jobs. That's why we've eroded the environment, and that's why there's tolerance for toxic waste. And that's why we've seen the greed of takeover attempts and the crash on Wall Street. Well, the question is, what is the answer of the establishment to these questions? Is it to crack down on the takeover attempts? Is that the end of my time? Thought the cake was done. Is it to crack down on these takeover attempts? No, the answer is to cut Social Security and to lower American wages. The vested interests are ready to let America decline as long as they can make a profit. Well, you may not think you have the power or the influence of those interests, but in Iowa and the caucuses and in the primary in New Hampshire, you have a vote. And on that day, your vote is the most powerful voice in the land. This is a test of our party. If we can't stand for workers and farmers, if we can't stand for seniors and consumers, then what really are we all about? And it's a test of whether or not we're going to bring back the promise of America and bring this country back to its truth. That's been my fight, and I hope it's your fight too. Thank you very much.
I apologize to you. My fingers slipped. I didn't want you to end. I was rather enjoying what you were saying. Mr. Dukakis, sir.
This campaign is about a very simple but a very profound idea, and it's the American dream. Something which I hope we can bring to every single citizen in this land. My dad came to this country and came here to Manchester, New Hampshire in 1912, seeking that dream, seeking opportunity, and he found it. My mother was the first Greek young woman in the history of Haverhill, Massachusetts, ever go beyond high school. She went to school in Maine, went to college, became a school teacher, began her teaching career in Ashland, New Hampshire. So for me, the dream is real, and for many of us here in New England, the dream is real. But for that worker in Waterloo, Iowa, who's lost a $12 or $13 an hour job and is now told he can go to work for $4 an hour without health insurance for his family, that dream is not real. For a youngster who works hard and graduates from high school with honors and can't afford to go to college, that dream is not real. For a young farm family that's trying to get by with 13 or 14% interest in its loan and is in danger of being foreclosed on, that dream is not real. And for those 2 million families sleeping on the streets of our cities and communities, that dream is a cruel joke. I want to be a president who makes that dream live for every single citizen and every family in this nation, and we can do that. Working together, investing together, building together, we can do it. I also want to be a president who helps shape a foreign policy which reflects American values, which ends this fiasco in Central America now, and which takes advantage of the best opportunity we've had to stop the arms race and to bring some sanity and good sense and stability and peace to this world. That's the kind of president America needs, and with your help, and no president has ever won the presidency without winning the New Hampshire primary. With your help, that's the kind of president I intend to be. Thanks for having us, and thanks especially to the young people for asking those good questions.
Well, I'd like to applaud all of you. I must say, I think you've done well, and I think the Republicans we had the week before did well, and I think to the audience I would only say before we end, we're just ending now, that sitting up here you get a much greater feeling of how hard these candidates work. In both parties you do. I mean, how much preparation goes into it, how much discipline goes into it, how much passion and conviction, and I think we can also say in this country patriotism. So my thanks to you Democrats, and my thanks to the Republicans before you. These two presidential candidate debates the hosts were the University of New Hampshire and Dartmouth. The sponsors were the Democratic and Republican parties of New Hampshire, which is a good thing for a political party to do, to sponsor things like this. The participants, 13 remarkable people in two debates, each of whom believes he can make a difference in our lives. And I suspect in the seriousness of this occasion, one of them is going to be the next President of the United States. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. The moderator was honored to be part of the process, and thank you for watching.